Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar with Luke Mackey from Moonrock. We're going to be looking at risk and BVLOS, the insurer's view. This is part of the BVLOS special interest group's activities, and we're delighted to be able to focus on particular areas within BVLOS and areas that will impact BVLOS so that we can understand it better and take it forward as an industry. I'm going to hand over to you now, Luke. We're delighted that you're here. Thank you very much for joining me and all our members here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Eleanor. And I can't see everyone behind the screen, but I'm sure there's a cheering crowd behind me. So yes, we're going to be looking at risk and BVLOS from the insurer's perspective today. My name is Luke Mackey. I'm the head of product at Moonrock Insurance. So I started out my career as a rating specialist at Allianz, and then was fortunate enough to find myself as the first employee of Moonrock Drone Insurance. And really, my role is focused on making sure that we have insurance products that meet the need of the ever-evolving drone industry. I'm a proud owner of my DJI Mini, but I'll say that I spend most of my time in a country that bans drones. So unless I'm hiking and potentially crashing the Mini, I don't get out too much on my drone, sadly. So today I want to start really with where insurance has come from. I'll talk to you a little bit about the strange history of the Lloyd's insurance market, a bit about how the art of underwriting works and why it's an art more than a science in many cases. What are the limitations of selling insurance in reality? You know, when we really get down to it, how there's always the ideal and the perfect world of knowledge and time, but like the triangle goes, you can do quick and cheap, or you can spend time and it gets more expensive. So in order to be able to sell insurance, there's certain things we need to put in place. Then I'll go on to why drones are difficult to underwrite compared to other traditional insurance products, such as house, car, marine, potentially some of the traditional older insurances that are out there. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, why most of you are here and interested, and hopefully won't bore you too much with the insurance side, but really about BVLOS operations and how as insurers we look at what data might be out there, what approach we can take with the art of underwriting, and how we think then we can improve our knowledge of BVLOS in the future. So where we're at the beginning stage now, what should we be looking at? And that's where really the Q&A will come in. What can we look at to improve in the future? So insurance, it started in Edward Lloyd's coffee house. Some people might know this. If you ever get a bored day, if you're ever waiting for a meeting in the City of London, you might see some blue plaques around, and it was all founded there. So it started in this coffee house, a lot of sailors, ship owners, and I'm assuming some wealthy individuals would hang out in this coffee house, and it started to become the place to go to get your maritime news, information, analytics. They would have discussions about what was going on. And eventually people wanted to insure the ships, but there was no market for maritime insurance, marine insurance. So some of the wealthier individuals, the individual investors, either out of morbid curiosity, gambling with a man's life, or with a real interest to make some money, or to protect, I can't say, they began to agree to insure a share of ship and cargo. So they would have a policy agreed amongst the group, and then they would write their name and the share of the risk underneath. And this is where the term underwriters actually comes from. So this has changed, you know, throughout the generations. Now we've got the famous Lloyd's of London building, which you'll see in the City of London opposite the Gherkin. And an interesting feature here is actually that all of the staircases, all of the ventilation, air conditioning, elevators, everything is on the outside to maximize the space here, which is the new coffee house, the new market. And much like Borough Market, these are the underwriters, the groups of individuals that have some kind of risk appetite. They might focus on equine insurance or sports. They want to cover Ronaldo's right toe, for example, or drones as well is now becoming a growing interest of many people. So this is called the box. And much like Borough Market, you can go up and you can present your risk. And it's moved on a little bit. There are platforms now in place, but essentially it comes down to people assessing the risk themselves, deciding what they want to take on, and then they write their name underneath. And actually what I found here is the original slip, the Lloyd's slip for the Titanic. So you can see here the names, and you can see how much of the portion of risk they wanted to take on, which might have been an unfortunate decision for them. So this rather boring slide is how you interact with an insurer. So I've talked about the London Lloyd's market. There is also insurance companies, but generally with something new and innovative around the world, we'll go through people with a more tenacious risk appetite, underwriters in the Lloyd's market. So there's still only really a handful. We're fortunate to work with Apollo, and we have a syndicate now of some great underwriters that will write up to the 50 million, 100 million, $100 million values. But in the early stages, these underwriters will say no. A lot of people have never heard of drones, they don't know about them, they don't want to deal with them. We then have the broker and the policyholder. So you guys as operators or people, any insurance policy you might buy, you may have to deal with a Lloyd's broker. So this could be AIG, Marsh, Willis. These may be companies that you've heard of. And the idea is that these Lloyd's brokers should know the risk that their policyholder is looking for, probably understand how to present it even better than the policyholder themselves. They go to the underwriter, they explain to the underwriter the risk in terms that the underwriter can then work with. Underwriter goes back with a price, and then it goes back to the broker and so on. In reality, quite often with something new like drones, the Lloyd's broker has never come across drones before. So we'll often have, I had a phone call just yesterday, and it really was just yesterday. It's not a turn of speech, but it was a broker who says, I've just come across, one of my clients is using drones. They're in surveying, and he's never heard of it. He's not really heard of a drone. He's not seen them. He knows that they're something that people might be using, but he just sends over a slip, and he says that we need to have this covered. That's where we come in as a managing agent. So managing agent generally will specialize in a specific use case. So we've specialized at Moonrock in drones. So in this case, we will help the underwriter to understand the specific use case of drones, what data there might be available, what kind of knowledge that there is out there, what is the industry showing, what kind of products should we be looking at. And then in these early stages, really, we can act as the broker as well, or we can advise the brokers, but it's about educating brokers. It's about ensuring underwriters are educated so they have more of an appetite for the risk. And then it all comes back down to the policyholder, hopefully getting cover that they require. So I'm not sure if this is going to work or not, because we tried the polling, but I wanted to go through really what the art of underwriting is. So we're going to remove ourselves from the drone expertise right now and think of this as we're an underwriter for housing, buildings and contents damage up to £1 million. So this is much like an underwriter looking at drones for the first time. They can just look at what's in front of them and start to make some really gut feel decisions and assumptions that feel right. And that's where the art of underwriting comes in. So Eleanor, I think we're going to try, maybe if people can vote on this. I don't know if I can see the votes, but just what we'll do is I'm going to show a series of images. And if you can just vote, maybe I don't know what options we have, like a thumbs up, maybe a heart for medium, and then I'm not sure what other options we have, Eleanor, for high risk.
Have a look. 2 seconds. Give me your question. I can put it into the poll right now.
Okay, so it will be low, medium, or high risk for each one, and then we can vote. So after each image, we'll vote on where would we place that in what pool of risk would we put it in? Would we say it's a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk? And the practice here is essentially you're always comparing against another risk. That's really the art of underwriting. So at the start, you make one decision and then it might change as we go on.
Okay. Let's see. So in the poll section, it might just pop up in a moment. I am going to see. This side of things is a little new to me.
I'll tell you what, I'm gonna flip onto the first one. So here's the first image. So we're going to cover this home. Somebody's come to us a proposal and they've asked for cover for buildings damage and contents damage. And a proposal form can have many images, but from this image, where might we like to place this? Low, medium, or high risk?
So I think everyone, if you go to polls and quizzes, that should give you the option to take part in this. Let's see.
Is that working okay?
I'm not sure. There's the answer.
Okay.
Alternatively, please in chat, put it in and let's go with chat and I'll work it out.
So if we can't do that, maybe if people can ask, so maybe some features that we would look here. I don't know if anybody would have identified these already, but things we'd look at here as an underwriter coming fresh to a new thing, you know, a new type of insurance. Maybe we'd look at the river. You know, what's the history of floods there? What's the flood forecasting? You know, what is the house constructed of, and how likely is it to be damaged by the water? These are the kinds of things that we might consider as an underwriter. You might look at also how much have people been paying on other houses in the area and how many losses have been made on there. And then you can kind of get a feel from there, is this worse or better than that? We might find that actually there's never been a flood in this area. There's plenty of rivers around and there's unlikely to be any floods in the future. So therefore the data would remove that high risk element. In this one, we'd maybe put it just a medium risk on first thought. I don't know if we got any votes in there, Eleanor.
We haven't. What I'm going to suggest is in the chat, you should be able to question 1 Riverbend. If
we'll move on to the next one.
Can.
So this would be what we'd probably call a low risk. You know, it's bricks and mortar, potentially some theft risk here with the windows available at the bottom end. But we'd probably put this in a low risk. Here, we have a house on a cliff edge. There's clearly some subsidence going here. So gut feel might be to put this in the high risk, let's say. But for example, we would look at this and for subsidence, this would probably be high risk. And what we would look at is maybe some data sources for what is the erosion rate for this cliff edge. But as another example, it looks like, you know, there's a nice car, it's parked off the street, low crime rate in the area, maybe the theft risk and is quite low for this property. You know, the building's contents, maybe they have really good fire damage controls, these kinds of things. So that although there's elements of the property that would be high risk, there's also elements that might be low risk. And then it's about what does the policyholder want to cover themselves for? Might we look at saying that we would cover this portion of the house, but this portion of the house wouldn't be covered under this year's policy, for example. There's lots of options, and these are the things that underwriters would look at. So this property, again, you know, it looks well built, well maintained. One of these windows breaks, it could be, you know, £50,000 immediately. So there's things like an excess that you could put in place or agree to. So would they put in an excess of, say, £50,000 for damage, in which case you're really covering the whole house if there's some serious damage caused. But if your dog runs into the window particularly fast and damages it, that would be something that you'd be paying out yourself. And it's called an element of self-insurance. It really comes down to the risk appetite of also the policyholder and how much premium do they want to pay now in a sense of how much they want to protect themselves. And this property here, you could maybe say there's some fire damage. Maybe it would be a medium or high risk. But again, it depends what we'd be covering the house for. Are we covering for replacement, restoration, for example? Is this grade listed? minor damage to the roof could be very, very expensive in these cases. And if we refer it back to drones, for example, prototyping, drones that have parts that are difficult to source, these kinds of things can really have an effect on the premium, because when it comes to making a claim, the damage in one case, say the damage of the roof to this house, is going to be quite considerably different to minor damage on this home here. So that's the idea of how an underwriter would look at a risk. And it's just some things that we can throw out there. It's at a very basic level, but the rhyme and reason rings true all the way across insurance. The reality of it is that when somebody buys insurance, in the majority of cases, you want to have a quick and easy quote journey. Now, if it's not quick because it's the first time we've done it, or it's a complex risk, there may be more time involved, but you still don't want to have undue questions, and you don't want a painful quote journey. A lot of times, the policyholder just wants to make sure that they're covered, and potentially it's just a case of ticking off a regulatory requirement as well. A lot of the time, clients might get in contact with us and say that we need insurance because of this regulation. How do we get it? What do we need to give you? And this is the issue, that a lot of clients, and most of the time the brokers even, don't understand the risk they're presenting. So they present some elements of the risk, but leave out key details. Now, our responsibility really as underwriters, and especially as underwriters that have grown in experience in underwriting things like drones and other innovative products, it's our experience that we need to go back and ask the right questions. It's about being an investigator and making sure that we pick up the right information. And it's still possible that with a lack of experience, a new underwriter, or in a new industry, there's going to be information missing, which is why I always try to recommend that when you are proposing insurance, try to go with the thought of anything that would improve safety, to put it in that proposal format and show. But if we go back through here, I mean, we just looked at a small number of houses here. If you think you get maybe minimum we get is 100 quotes a day, but let's say we really scaled up and across the industry you're looking at 10,000 a day. It's not possible to look in detail to every single risk. So the solution is online automated quote and bind platforms. Now, once you're removing that human element, and there will be some element of referrals and human element that's included, it's never just going off to a computer and computer says no, or it shouldn't do in most cases. We really have to concentrate down each risk to a set variable that we can then measure and value and put through algorithms and set out in data on a large scale. So if we were to look at this in the houses, what kind of questions might people be happy to answer? And if we flip this, as a drone operator, what kind of questions do you have which the answers are readily available to? For example, do you have a rough idea of how many hours you might fly? Yes. Do you know the exact number of hours you're going to fly? It's unlikely. So it's unfair for us to assume that we can ask for the exact number of hours to fly, as an example. In these cases, people might not know the subsidence. So then we have to go away and look at third-party data. They might not have their own survey done, and we look at third-party data that we have available and put it forward. A survey might be done on the house and it conflicts with that third-party data, and then we can review it and work with the policyholder to go through it. And as we talked about exclusions, maybe to improve the risk, like here, they'd be excluded from covering that part of the house. Maybe, for example, if you're looking for coverage for a prototype drone, we might not cover the labor costs to replace that drone if there was an issue in testing. Or if you would like, but the premium's going to be higher, you could look for coverage for the labor costs as well. It's really a negotiation and a matter between the policyholder and what the underwriter is willing to provide. So there's just a bit of information here. So if you think all of that work goes into it, there's all these people, and especially home insurance, there's a lot of data out there. There's flood data, weather data, land surveys, everything out there. And still in 2022, for every £1 that property insurers received, £1.22 in claims was paid out in claims and expenses. So you could read that they made a 22% loss. Now, in reality, a lot of underwriters will actually take in money and they can invest a portion of it in the market, so that it's not like they'll make as much of a loss as it might look here. Maybe they made 10% of the markets as a 12% loss. But this is the reason that there's loss provisions. And when an insurer is looking at a risk, it has to be looked at on a large scale and long term, not in the short term. Because if you looked at this in the short term and we think, well, we did it this year, next year, let's look at it again for the next year. Same thing happens again quite quickly. Businesses close down, they can't run the funds and they have to let their policyholders down. So just as an example of a loss provision, and because every good presentation should have some picture of a nuclear bomb going off. So insurers would assume with the drone industry that there's going to be a major £1 million loss, $1 million loss, €1 million loss every 10 to 20 years. Now, thankfully, we're about 10 years into real common small commercial use, and there hasn't been this $1 million, £1 million loss yet. But that's not to say it doesn't happen over the long time. Now, it would have been nice to ask what some of these could be. I don't know, Eleanor, if anybody would like to answer questions, but I know we have experts in cybersecurity, operators, regulators. It would be really great. We have some ideas already, but
so we do. I have enabled the chat function now. Sorry, it's the Zoom update yesterday has slightly thrown me a little bit. I've enabled the chat, so if you want to add things in, comments in and messages into the chat, that's absolutely fine. Equally, do add them into the Q&A section as well.
Okay. So yeah, if anybody's there and they have an idea of what we should be looking at, mid-air collision with multiple casualties, absolutely. Especially when we're looking around airports. And I mean, it was explained to me how damaging a small bird strike can be to an RAF plane. Then a drone can absolutely happen, and there's enough cases of near misses. So yeah, mid-air collision with multiple casualties. I mean, God forbid something happened at an airport with a commercial airliner. We're looking at a drone maybe losing connection, falling on top of a car on the M25 and causing some kind of pile-up, and there's a death recorded. Potentially some kind of cybersecurity threat. So potentially there's swarm drones or multiple drones around, and some kind of threat that's able to control those drones and use them for malicious purposes. These are the kinds of things that would be big losses to the industry, and in many cases, much more than £1 million loss. And insurers have what's called reinsurance for this. So there's always provisions being made, and it's worth keeping in mind that with every premium, there's the premium for that year, but there's always amounts being put away for these longer term, large losses that could occur. And in aviation assumptions, each person is worth circa one. Yeah, exactly. So we always assume, so really 1 million is the cost of a life. So we're looking at the same thing. So, I mean, it could just be as simple as a drone falls and it lands on somebody's head and it kills them. That is, that's the sort of thing that we could be looking at for something that happens every 10 to 20 years. Now, as we said, it hasn't happened in the first 10 years. Does that mean it's not going to happen for another 10 years? Well, I bring this back down to a coin toss and the law of large numbers. So if we go to flip a coin, and I was going to flip a coin here, but I couldn't find my wallet this morning. So we know the probability is 50-50 mathematically, and from school, we know it's a 50-50. But if I flipped a coin here now, the first 5 times I could quite easily get heads 5 times. But we still know that it's 50-50. So what are we getting wrong here? Well, if we try it 10,000 times, we might assume that we'd start to get close to that 50-50. And according to Murphy's law, as we know, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And so if it's 50-50, let's look at what might, as in theory, let's say that the tails is what's going wrong here. We have a big bet on. What happens over 10,000? So, I mean, in this clip, if you're into, I don't know, there's a lot of probably YouTube lives going on, or I could do commentary. I probably wouldn't be very good at commentary for horse racing, but we got tails ahead a little bit here, heads, tails ahead. But as we can see, it's landing pretty even. But any point along here, one or the other is slightly ahead. And then we get all the way up nearly to 10,000 here. 10,000 goes and we land. And we are within 0.01% of what we would expect the probability to be. Let's see if I can exit this. There we go. So if we think about this and we relate it back to drones, and I may go off on tangents here, but if we relate this back to drones, I would consider us now in the drone industry at those early stages, those first 5 tosses, and the data that we capture and the assumptions that we make, we have to stay open-minded that over the long term, they could be wrong. Now, with some operations, such as small commercial surveying, BVLOS operations, now this is really becoming part of everyday life, and there certainly is data that we're getting to those mid-ranges of some probable certainty. However, in other areas, such as BVLOS operations, deliveries, light displays, agriculture, we're really in the first year, in some cases, that these are actually being operated. So we're at those first 5 coin tosses. So this is the difficulty with trusting the data. And what we want to work on is getting to a point where we have more data so we can make more accurate predictions for the future. And just as for example here, this is a 1 in 2, a 50-50 chance. Now, drones are not a 50-50 chance. There's many variables and many unknown variables. If we look at a dice, and this is also potentially just because I liked these videos, and there was 2 of them. This is the second one. So this is rolling dice 10,000 times. Now, we could ask many questions here. Is the code set up accurately? Is this guy running a gambling scam on YouTube? We don't know, but here we go. So we've got 5 is far ahead, 3's down, and at least when we get up to near 10,000 now, we would have maybe expected to get up to a pretty even 1 in 6. However, we don't. What we see is that it's still uneven and there's differences. So the reason I show this is because in these cases, we know the probability. We know that a dice is 1 in 6. We know that a coin toss is 50-50. Over the same 10,000 turns, those results were not quite the same. So with more variables, there's a requirement for more data, more turns to be able to reach that equilibrium. Now, if we look at drones, the difference to this compared to the coin toss and the dice roll is we don't actually know a lot of the probabilities. We can make educated guesses and we can use the data available, and we have many people that are studying the risk of this every day, which we're grateful for. However, there's no perfect knowledge, a known probability for any of these scenarios yet. This is where the data is needed, and as much data as possible over a longer length of time as possible, so that we can start to take the assumptions that we've made and start to make some certain predictions for the future. So just as an example, I mean, if we go back to the low, medium risk example, there's lots of different types of drones. There's lots of different uses of drones. And I was fortunate enough to find a Phantom 2, which some people might recognize and have long forgotten, with the GoPro attached to it. But drones have developed a long way from here. And some of the assumptions that we might have made when these were first operating are no longer true. For example, a drone is something that is relatively heavy and can cause quite a lot of damage to somebody if there's a collision. Well, now most drones are sub 250 grams, and unfortunately collisions do happen, but even recently there was a sub 250 drone that fell on a young boy's head. There's some minor damage, but certainly not the same kind of damage we might have had from a Phantom 2. So things have changed a lot. Now, the weight is a big variable there, but those assumptions that we might have made in the early stages, we may not have imagined that drones could get so light. We've got fixed wing drones, long range BVLOS drones here. We've got agricultural crop spraying drones. We've got deliveries that are potentially interacting quite closely with people that are not involved with drones or understand the safety around them. And then we've got light displays. We've got large numbers of these drones effectively automatically operated in the air and how are these controlled? Now we understand there's geofencing and there's many controls for these in place, but this is all early knowledge and it's all in the early stages, so it could all change. So to some of the tools that we use as drone underwriters, and this is probably the bit that people really came here to listen to, so I apologize if it's been a boring start to the insurance element. So we've got industry data and reporting. So we're very thankful for organizations like ARPAS, 𝗪𝗔𝗍𝗄. We can look at AirProx reports, MORs, and there are elements of data out there that can show qualitatively what happens when there's an incident. We can take in data from many different sources as much as we can, and then we can look at it compared to with the policy data that we have, the kind of book of insurance that we have, and we can use some of that data to try and assess what would be a fair premium. If we need to take in this much per year to pay out claims for this group of people, what would improve the risk of this operator versus this operator? And this is where we look at things. I mean, for a very basic one would be the value of the drone. Somebody with higher value drones should pay a higher value of the premium because there's a risk that they would have more paid out if there was a total theft, as an example. A more experienced pilot should probably pay less than a less experienced pilot. We've got our in-house claims experience, and that's how we know how much we've paid over the last 7 years, and how much do we then think we might pay over the next 10 years? Are those claims starting to come down? Does that mean that we can bring the premiums down? We have the client proposal forms, which are certainly improving as people understand drones better and they've maybe not buying insurance for the first time. And then we can draw really on third-party expertise. And I've put the little eyes emoji because that is where this forum really comes in. And this is where the discussions that we'll be able to have today come in. And that as underwriters, we'd be looking to people for their feedback as well. I'm just reading the questions and think of using something like a big M3. Exactly. So the drone mass there exactly is something that we, of course, look at every day. I mean, it's something that you would have to look at. So BVLOS drone operations. Now, if you think about how I just showed you some images of a house, and we are not home buildings and contents underwriters, drone operators. I'm specializing in drone insurance. So we've made some experiential assumptions when underwriting there. Drone underwriters in the early stages, and many underwriters are still seeing drones for the first time, are making those first early assumptions. BVLOS is a new element there. So we're thankful that we have experience in drone operations. But the question is, with BVLOS, what should we be looking at? So some of the things I wanted to put up here that I think are very much up for discussion. The good that we look for in BVLOS is that these operations are generally well planned and well monitored, mostly because they're heavily assessed by the local CAA before their approval, and following the approval also to be able to maintain that. And with all of this comes the fact that we would generally make an assumption that a BVLOS operator has proven themselves to have enough experience and enough knowledge of the mitigating safety risk that the local CAA has approved them. So we would assume that these are responsible operators that we have an element of trust. They're going to be handling the drones well. They're going to be maintaining the batteries correctly. They're probably going to be following the OSC better than others that might not be as heavily regulated. The bad of BVLOS is, like with everything else that we've shown, there's a lack of large-scale data. So there is data out there, and there's data in isolation. Eleanor mentioned that the military, for example, have been capturing data right from the beginning and all around the element of their BVLOS testing. However, does that necessarily apply to small commercial pilots or agriculture or drone deliveries? In some ways, yes, and in theory, yes. But when we're talking about how much are we going to pay out and how much should people pay and real figures for the next year and onwards, is it enough to go on and make an informed decision? Probably not. And a lot of these cases, it might be the first time attempting a BVLOS operation. If it's not the first time, then it's certainly going to be the first year or so. This is probably the key one, and I saw this in a 𝗟𝗶𝗁 meeting recently, that see and avoid, and I apologize if I've used the term incorrectly, is often the most effective method for avoidance. So after every single other element has failed, notifications, sense and avoid, eventually it comes down to you see an obstacle and you avoid it. Without BVLOS, in BVLOS, that element is taken away in the majority of cases. So that's obviously the key element. And there's a lot of work that goes into BVLOS to mitigate this, which is why there's the good, but it's still a clear drawback. And the last one is the loss of connection can go very wrong very quickly because of the potential distance and the control that can be captured afterwards. So with that, I really would like to look for now maybe some, if I can get the chat up here, some feedback on the sort of things we might look at in different areas. Now, there's going to be people with all different kinds of experience on this forum today. But if we're talking BVLOS for agriculture, so things that we might want to look at is the obstacle avoidance is going to be very important. Notifying the ground personnel that there's going to be a drone, quite a heavy drone flying around the field automatically. The battery maintenance. Now, I know the XAG drone, for example, has high quality batteries where you can't put the like a puffy battery, an aged battery potentially into the clip. But then there's also cases where drone batteries fall out because they've not been clipped in correctly. So we have to keep that in mind. The battery maintenance, especially with these large heavy lift drones, is very important. And the terrain mapping. So the reason I raise this is, and it's not with BVLOS, but we set often with what we've seen in the past year, since this has been approved in the UK, is that many agricultural drones have crashed into power lines. And this is because the power line is set at a certain height, but the drone's been told to follow a height above the terrain. So there's a dip here and the drone follows it, but that means that there's also a power line there and it crashes into it. So that's something that we've then worked with training providers to go back out and give feedback. So hopefully next year, we've been able to use some data, make some information, and put it back out. So now next year, we shouldn't see as many losses for that, hopefully. Eleanor, I can't see the chat here, so I apologize if I'm missing any comments. There we go. How would this be different to SORA? Why would insurance not use tools that operators are having to use for the CAA permissions? As all tools mentioned, what the CAA used to make operation assessments. So it means for the CAA to share permissions drafted with insurers, so it's not a single pipeline of data. So to Alex's point here, there's no difference really to SORA, and SORA scoring is something that we would like to use. The difficulty is that the SORA scoring is not used worldwide, and we're a worldwide insurer. So that's one element of it, but certainly in the UK, it is something that we take into consideration. The tools, so the other issue that really, if we get into it, is that the SORA method is a manual method that has to be taken in on every single case. And as we showed, really, once an underwriter is spending time on every single use case to analyze the risk, that means that their time then becomes an element of the premium. So we need to try and concentrate down to data and variables that can be used quickly on an online platform if we're to scale up the insurance. Now, in most cases, a BVLOS operation is something we would look at manually, and certainly in-house, we are using the SORA methodology to try and assess risk, but you can't go into the same depth that an operator would, or the CAA. We take the assumption that the CAA has approved this for safety, and we're looking at it more of the financial impact of potential things that could be safe, but still cause issues. So for example, a battery falling out and the drone crashes into a field. It is in a safe area, it's been mitigated, there's nobody in the area. However, that drone could be worth $70,000, and now that's a financial impact. So that's that's one of the nuances between insurance and the CAA. But certainly the CAA should be sharing permissions. And this is a difficulty that we have when it comes to pilots, is there's no way of validating a pilot's experience or if they've had any claims in the past or incidents in the past. There's no way of validating that. It's not like the car insurance market where you can go in and you can see what kind of records people have. It's not possible with drone insurance. For data sources for fixed wing survey, then we might look at, for example, the NOTAMs that are put in place, signal strength logs. We would not consider it so much because it's generally less. It's not going to be in contact with the ground. It's going to be at higher elevations. The obstacles becomes less of an issue, and latency control logs become much more impactful. So I see another question from Alex. So how do you the financial impact? The assumptions of a drone ops are approved. You look at material risk of the third-party risk. How do you blend that as a percentage split different categories? So it's two different covers. So when we're looking at a risk, if you look at the third-party risk and we're covering it up to $1 million, first of all, fortunately for claims experience, there's very, very low number of claims for third-party risk. So sometimes things will happen to a third party, but an insurance claim is never made. Maybe there's an agreement between people, or it's not major enough damage for it to be reported. There's some other insurance in place. So third party risk does often have lower number of claims anyway. It's also covered up to $1 million. So when we're looking at third party risk, then this would be things like bodily injury, damage. If there's going to be a loss, it's likely to be very high. It's going to be there's going to be legal fees and lots of other elements and investigations into a large third-party risk. So that's how the percentages are set. Now, generally and truthfully, what we use is we take base rates that have worked for the past 10 years, and we look at specific use cases on the ground. Are there obstacles to be damaged? Is there a building that is a particular value? An open field with it's private, there's no third-party risk apart from potentially some external factors of a person coming into contact, an uninvolved person that wasn't known to be there. It's a very small risk, but then it could be £1 million. So then you would kind of look at that risk. There's a 1% chance. How much would it be realistic to pay out? How much is in the pot already? And that's where those percentages come in. The material risk is in the property damage. Largely depends on, well, what can be damaged. The drone can be damaged. And if we look at the book of business and how much we pay out per year already, and generally it falls around 40 to 50% of premium is paid out in claims. With this drone, let's say the 𝗔𝗥𝗣𝗔𝗦 one is of X value, it's flying, and we know that the 𝗔𝗥𝗣𝗔𝗦 drones have a pretty good record. They don't often crash. So our base rate for drones would be, say, it's not, but let's say it was 15%. It's much lower, but let's just say it was 15%. The 𝗔𝗥𝗣𝗔𝗦 drone being flied by an experienced operator, we might reduce that some element. But generally, it's about using those law of large numbers. And it really is assessing how much we're paying out in claims if we can segment. So if we can segment all of the light display drones, I think we've got that on here next, or drone deliveries. Let's say there's a big amount of drone delivery operators out there. And at first, it's a case of making educated guesses. So we would take base rates from other drones, load for the impact of potential to third-party risk here. And then over the year, we would see how much we pay out on claims. So let's say the claims rate, the loss ratio, we're paying out 10% of claims. Then we know that next year the premiums were too high. They can come down significantly, and we would track it. And in the following year, the loss ratio comes up slightly to 20%. And then you know that you're in the right area. Any data that comes in can then help and assist with those decisions. But at the end of the day, it has to come down to a real financial impact. And a real financial impact is how much is paid out in claims. And that's probably the key thing. the key measure at the end of the day for insurance is how much is actually being paid out in claims, because there's always the factor of people don't claim as well. So you can do all of the analysis in the world, but if people don't claim, then there's also this factor. So it's a shame we haven't got the feedback here, because it would be good to understand from the group what kind of data sources they think we should be looking at in some of these cases. So we've got drone deliveries, where we might look at, as I said, experience of how many flight hours, frequency of flight, the number of, the proximity to people, the average value of the house, the average value of the product, and also the maintenance of the drones as an example. And then drones in a box is a new one that we've started to see come through that we're quite excited about. So, if we're looking at drone in a box, which is about as BVLOS as we can get, what data sources could we be capturing from these operators? And ideally, operators that we work with will share as much data as possible, but at what stage can we start to make those informed decisions to start saying, these are things we're certain of and these things we're not aware of yet, or we're assumptions that we need to confirm. So that's where it really comes on to questions. And unfortunately, we've not been able to do a lot of the back and forth because I wasn't aware that we wouldn't be able to speak. But Ellen, I don't know if we can open now to questions, and I think we might be able to get through.
Absolutely, we can open up to questions, and what I can do also is enable people can add to the chat or via Q&A at the moment. We do absolutely welcome questions, and I will make a start, and let's see where we get with.
So I see a question from Jeremy. If BVLOS proved to be a higher risk and evidenced by larger claims, how would this affect premiums for day-to-day VLOS work? So as insurers, we really want to segment as much as possible. And again, in the earlier days, the common theme to be able to build out a book of insurance that you can then cover, there has to be enough people putting money into one pot so that there's enough money in there to pay out. If you try and specialize too much, you might have one BVLOS operator that would be putting into a pot for BVLOS, and effectively they're self-insuring, so it would never work. So you have to share it through commonality. So in the early days, it was just drones, and BVLOS, if there was a BVLOS operator in there, they might be in there with VLOS. So potentially a large BVLOS claim could have affected VLOS. In reality, that's the sort of case where we would investigate the claim and we would notice that it was a BVLOS and then potentially put a loading on for BVLOS in the future. So it's unlikely in this specific use that the BVLOS is going to affect premiums for VLOS work. If anything, the data that we can capture from BVLOS operators, because they're more willing to share data with us, and they track the drone much more accurately, is more likely to provide us data that we can then reduce premiums on the VLOS work. So I hope that answered the question, Jeremy.
Mm-hmm. So another question we've got is, so if this is done on a large scale, then a drone operator who has a better safety management system, just culture, etc., isn't really recognized from an insurance perspective. The assumption being that's an internal thing, whereas you say it's a claim. The question is, what data could insurers compulse, e.g. manufacturer component failure, unless they aren't willing to place the insurance?
Yes, so this is a key thing. So manufacturer component failure is something that we do want to use. However, when we've started to look at it, the drone manufacturers that are out there, for example, DJI, they will potentially promote manufacturer component failure. How trusted could that be? As an example, this isn't traditional aviation. There isn't true black box data. There is not the same level of scrutiny under drone manufacturing as there is in traditional aviation. So although component failure is something we would look at, and certainly on a much larger scale, the difficulty is that in our claims experience and the small number of claims, I mean, if we think about the number of operators that there are, then if we're looking at 40% claims, the values of the claims are up. There's a relatively small number of claims to actually quantify and assess whether that manufacturer component failure correlates to an actual figure with a financial figure in a claim. So it's an indicator. We do like it to say, if this is for 100,000 hours, well, we know then that over the next 5 years, if they're flying 10,000 hours, it should be fine. But when we're talking about the finer variables, you can't use these things. I'm just reading the first bit again. So if the drone is large scale, then the drone operator has a better safety management system, just culture isn't really being recognized from an insurance perspective. So in terms of culture, the question is, how do we measure this? And again, when we're talking in the early stage, unfortunately, if we're talking about a group of BVLOS operators, you can't yet segment who's a good BVLOS operator and who's not. Because if we did that, you would have good BVLOS operators paying into a pot that never pays anything out. And you'd have bad BVLOS operators that pay into a pot and it all gets paid out and they end up just self-insuring. It would be a complete loss. So the two get blended together. When we do that blending, yes, there's some element of trying to measure the culture, but there's not a way of accurately measuring this and putting our financial impact on it. I would love to know if there is a way. If there's a way that we think we could measure this, fantastic. But I wouldn't know of a way to put a number against culture. A feeling, yes, a feeling is something that we can have through the quote journey. It's something manually we can do, and that's the art of underwriting. But as a science, there's not a number that we can associate with this.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to the questions. We've got a few in here to look at. What additional standards or certifications, so this very much sort of builds into the question that we were just talking about. What additional standards or certifications do you anticipate insurers will demand from drone manufacturers and operators? Is robust cybersecurity something you would take into consideration?
Absolutely. I think, again, this really comes into, it's something that we would assume as an underwriter. So the majority of people are using the same drones. It's DJI, it's Helios, Flybe. There's the majority of operators are using the same handful of manufactured drones. And so we really make an assumption that those major risks, those cyber risks, are already being covered. So certainly, if we have a manufacturer that works with us, and for example, Light Display Software is an organization that we've worked with quite closely, and they've really opened up what their firmware is good and bad at. So one example is the return to home function on light displays. When they were coming into land, if they lost even momentary link, the show would come down. Because it's the safest way to do it. If the drones don't know where they are, if they lose their RTK network and they're off by just a few meters, it could be catastrophic. So the show would freeze and it comes down to land. Now that could be £500,000 worth of equipment in the air. It comes down and according to every OSC, it's safe, but it lands over water. Lands in the water, everybody's safe, disaster, avoided. However, insurers now need to pay out £500,000 for equipment, plus clean up, legal fees, replacement costs, all these other elements. So that comes into it. The software company that we've been speaking with in their latest firmware will now, first of all, they're going to train people to not put it over water, and we can advise that in our proposal form as well. But they're also going to put in the firmware that the drone wouldn't land over water. So if they come over, if there's a possibility to land in water, they would instead hover and then wait for manual control to be taken over. So that is something that we certainly do take into consideration, because previously the losses that I could find in light displays was all to do with the drones landing in water. That was the major loss. There might be other small cases, but that was the major loss that would occur. And with that removed because of that software, that firmware update, if an operator is using that firmware, then I can remove that element of an increased risk of that claim occurring.
That's good, thank you. A further question is, should insurers have aviation expertise and drones to be able to judge if a policy makes sense? As the thinking is, if you can get insurance, then the CAA judges it as safe. Whereas you've actually mentioned earlier on, if the CAA think makes sense and is safe, then you'll give them insurance. That sounds very
Absolutely.
much, it's sort of chicken and egg situation there.
So I wouldn't say it is. So we've spoken with the CAA, and we had quite a similar conversation with them, actually, thankfully. The CAA is concerned with public safety and air safety in the aviation space. Insurers, as I've shown right back to those early days, essentially are looking to run a business that is protecting people, for one, but earning money off of risk. So as we said to the CAA, it would be a risky business to get into, so to speak. But if a drone was killing somebody every single day, and that was happening, the insurance would still be there. We would insure people. It would just be very expensive. And if you look at cars, for example, you can get bans of car insurance for people that have bad, drink driving records, speeding fines, all of these things. There is a market to insure these people. It's just very expensive because the claims are going to be very high. So our responsibility as insurers is not to decide whether it's safe or not. Our job as an insurer is to make sure that when something goes wrong, there's enough money gathered to pay out on those claims. And that's what the CAA is interested in, is making sure that we understand the risk enough to be able to ensure that there's enough premium in there to pay out on risks. And by this point, the insurers that are out there, we've got a good relationship. We have a proven record of paying out on claims. And that's why the CAA understand that the insurance is not the issue when it comes to approvals. And if anybody's been told that, then they can certainly get in touch with us, because it's not the case. We will cover almost anything. And if the CAA are the responsible ones to making sure that it's safe, it's their responsibility. We will just cover it and try and assess the financial impact.
Okay. Something that's come across very strongly in your presentation, which has been fantastic, thank you, and very, very interesting, is the data sources side of things. Do you feel there are areas that are missing? Are there data sources that we could be using as an industry and having access to, whether they're sort of held by a third party that everyone can access in order to make BVLOS a sort of a safer journey? Is there something we can do on that side?
Definitely. I mean, we talk about data sources. There's certainly data out there, and the number of times we'll speak to an organization and they have the military, the police, a blue light service, an operator, particularly public services are quite good at collecting data. Networks collect this data, but they can't share it with us. So that's the first thing. We have a data lake that we can put data in. We anonymize it. And the first hurdle really is to explain to people that this is not going to put premiums up. They can only come down. And if it hasn't come across already, I want to make clear that as insurers, we're really assuming the worst. Whatever will happen is going to happen. So we're assuming that these worst cases are going to occur. So if you give us any data to prove otherwise, we're always happy, because it will bring the premiums down. In terms of data sharing, things that we look for, so common themes in claims that would be fantastic to capture data around are things like flyaways. So we're working with networks as an example of where are there, what can affect data links? What would cause a connection loss? Those kinds of things. If we can have data around that, we can then inform people, or we can start to segment on what makes a good risk or a bad risk around flyaways. Training the pilots about what to do after they have a loss of control. Battery health is something that we consider a lot more now, because some drones have been around in operation for 5 years already. Their batteries are starting to age. So where in the early stages, those first 2 years, there wasn't really a risk to the age of a battery or battery maintenance, whether you're looking after it well or not, over those first year or two, it didn't really make a difference. Now, we are getting to the point where you'll start to see the difference between well-maintained drones and batteries compared to poorly maintained drones and batteries. However, until there's a claim, there's no way of actually assessing that. So in-flight data, battery volt variations, as an example, the rotor response, these kinds of things are data on a large scale that we could be capturing to not just assess what might cause a claim, but also to start to red flag things that might give cause to a claim in the future, because there's no MOT on a drone. It's not like a car. We don't know what the quality of the drone is, or we can't have everybody send us a drone in and check it over manually. We have to kind of take an assumption on it. The first thing really is I'll just press on, as operators, if you can share flight data with us, that's the best thing you can do, because then we can see how many flights are occurring, how many flights occur without any issues. We can trust that when we've been told a certain number of hours, that's what's actually occurring. And it's the closest way we can get to a pay-per flight model. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Interesting. Okay, so I've got additional questions here. Just to clarify, Moonrock seemed to be very much based within the commercial sector of drones, like displays, delivery, etc. Is that fair? I'd be curious to get your thoughts on how insurance works in defence and critical infrastructure.
So probably from this presentation, correct. I focused mostly on BVLOS in this way. I personally find it one of the more interesting aspects. But no, as Moonrock, I didn't really go into the defense or to the critical infrastructure, but that's something that we're also supporting. Network rail, a lot of defense drones, and military testing, for example, before something goes out to be delivered. So we do things right up to the large Heron drones. So those things are certainly things we look at. The difficulty is that the commonality with particularly the defense drones and the sort of the commercial space are two different things. And the way we segmented, we just launched our hobbyist product, so recreational pilots. We then have our small commercial, which is surveying, film, TV, and camera drone work is what we really call it. And then, as I talked about, the new space, and then larger organizations, larger fleets. So large organizations with large fleets of drones. I talked about blue light services. Some of the governments around the world, they will have large fleets of drones. We also insure those as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Fascinating. So a lot of what's coming out of what you're saying is that the data isn't held necessarily by operator, or except the flight data obviously is, but those who hold the data, such as potentially the manufacturer, and that there's very little root cause that's shown for incidents. Yes.
So unfortunately, that really comes into claims experience. And we talked about this yesterday, Eleanor, that most insurers, they'll have a small claims team. So you've already got the underwriter that might specialize in something and drones are new to them. The claims team really don't know what a drone is. And now certainly public knowledge is improved. There's some specialist claims investigators out there. But again, it comes down to the reality of most people want their claim paid fast and they want it paid out in the amount they've said. So there's always a balancing act between making it an easy process for everyone involved and also not paying out on fraudulent claims. Unless there's something that spikes our interest, that's when we'll maybe drill into a particular claim. But that's where, as we said, like the 𝗂𝗶𝘁 committee, as an example, are fantastic because they drill down. So a lot of the claims that we see will land as reports there, and they'll be investigated anyway by different people.
Do policies include acts of God exclusion clauses?
Yeah, so I know so Alex, I think, has some questions about insurance in general, but so acts of God, we don't exclude it. We don't exclude it specifically. I don't believe so. Acts of God are those, what we would call, thing with act of God is for insurance companies to be able to put finance against it, they can't predict it. So you can't value it. That's the problem. So a lightning strike, as an example, is something that we would probably pay out on. But say there was across the UK a major lightning strike that took out every single drone in the air. Is that something that the insurance company could have seen coming? No. And that's where really things like governments step in. Generally, acts of God are things where governments should be expected to come in because there's national funding for those things. So it's some acts of God will be taken out. It's a bit of a get out clause, to be honest. That's the problem. Heart attacks, these kinds of things in travel insurance.
Okay.
Drones and aviation is not so much of a thing.
We've got another question along the similar lines. Is there any consideration for agony of the moment due to its use within civil litigation for injustices?
I am not sure about what agony of the moment means. I will say, in terms of litigation, so far the number of third-party claims is very, very, very low. But as an example, we have had one claim which should be a very basic claim. It was a drone that crashed into a boat, some paint damage, and it should have just been repainted. It was very, very minor cosmetic damage to the boat. However, the boat was it was a high value boat. It was due to be rented out that weekend. They then didn't rent it out because of the damage. And they also have quite expensive lawyers. So now that claim that could have been maybe settled for, say, let's say £5,000 quite fairly, has now been inflated to £100,000 and is being disputed. And that's the problem with third-party claims and how quickly they can escalate.
Interesting. Okay. Have we got any further questions at the moment? That we do have one sort of left, but I think it's very much something that we've already covered at the moment.
I would like to I will just say this one. So in terms of the insurance industry having experience in-house of drones so they can get the right feel for things, I certainly agree with this. And actually, if you look at aviation, so some of the underwriters we've got are pilots, they're airline engineers. What I would say the problem with the drone industry, and I think, and again, we're just at that tipping point, is that until now, there was very few people that had experience in the drone industry. They might have been the first to do it, but they wouldn't have been truly experienced to a level where it was worth bringing them in as a consultant. Now, it is something that we start to consider, and we do work with experts to assess the risk in some cases. The issue is that often the assumptions that they come up with are the same things that we're looking at as underwriters every day, because with experience as an operator, or maybe even writing OCs or working with the CA or any aspect, it's still not looking at risk in the same way that we have as many risks as we look at every day, and getting, unfortunately, really that gut feel for how much do we think that's going to cost this year. That's where I'm trying to get down to the art of underwriting. It really is looking at what you've got on the book, how much we're paying out, what's our gut feel on this, taking the data. And I should say that we don't want to be using the art of underwriting. That is not the end goal. And particularly at Moonrock, we want to complete what's called informed underwriting. So we want to have data to remove ourselves from it so that we can use informed underwriting, starting to use some AI, machine learning. This is what we want to get to. But in all honesty, the insurance products that have tried this, drone insurance products that have tried to do the science of it, have fallen out of the market because the data, just like those 5 first coin flips, can lead you off in a very, very incorrect direction. And once you've built it in that way, without that human element and that gut feel, you can end up in a very dangerous place.
So the messaging there from this piece is that we need data. You need data. We need data to take it forward.
I think it's more sharing of data.
Yeah, access to data. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that's a very good message to be taken forward. Thank you very much, indeed, Luke, for taking the time to talk to us about this side of things, explaining so much of the industry, both sort of what seems like the very basics, but actually it's really important to be able to understand that in the first place, and then sort of extending it on out to how that impacts onto the BVLOS side of things. Do we have any further questions at the moment? If not, in the meantime, I'll give you sort of 30 seconds or so to think about that. In the meantime, I'm going to plug next week's webinar, which is on just culture and aviation, clearly an element that is vital right across the industry, whether to BVLOS or to insurance, and ensuring people that people and organisations have the right attitude towards what we're doing within the drone industry is crucial. So I do highly recommend signing up to that one. The details are on the ARPAS website, www.arpas.uk, and it should be there on the homepage. We welcome everyone to attend, and it's free to all within the industry and on a wider scale. So do share that as well. We are very much keen to encourage that safety lessons are topped up, so to speak, on a regular basis, so that it becomes part of the way you think on a everyday basis. Okay, we don't have any more questions, so I think we'll leave it there then for the moment. Thank you, Luke, very much indeed for taking your time to put the presentation together and then to answer our questions so knowledgeably as well. Thank you very much indeed to Moonrock.
Thank you very much for having me. As I said, if anyone would like to get in touch, then I'd love to speak with them.
Lovely, that's great. We have recorded the session, or we are recording the session, and in due course I will share the Watch Again link with everyone as well. Okay, thanks very much indeed then.
Bye-bye.